What Iraq inquiry was and why was it formed?
Iraq inquiry was set up to look into in terms of finding out what exactly happened.
The right-wing rhetoric or the rise of right-wing rhetoric that we have and the historic parallels. And one of the greatest examples would be the Roman Empire and the collapse of Roman Empire as we knew of it. Are there lessons that could help us strengthen our foundation?
The right-wing rhetoric that you're getting, what we need if we really want to deal with it is to go beyond the rhetoric. Why are they saying it?
Women and women empowerment. I cannot think of a person better than you to talk about that.
If you concentrate too much and you develop a victim mentality, this is happening to me because I'm a woman or I'm an Asian or I'm an immigrant, actually diminish yourself to some extent. Be resilient, be sure of who you are. In whatever work I do, I want them to be confident.
You've had a rich career, so much that you. What is one legacy that you wish to leave behind?
Hello and welcome to the Talk League. Today we are honored to welcome the Right Honorable Baroness Usha Prashar of Radheed, a distinguished member of the House of Lords and a trailblazer in championing diversity, inclusion and justice. Baroness Prashar has led and chaired numerous influential public, voluntary and private sector organizations, including the Runnymede Trust, the Parole Board, the Civil Service Commission, the National Literacy Trust, which she co-founded. Her remarkable career spans criminal justice, constitutional affairs, education and philanthropy, driven by her unwavering commitment to creating ethical leadership, inclusive change. From being Deputy Chair of the British Council to serving on the Iraq inquiry and the Royal Commission on Criminal Justice, her insights have shaped public policy at the highest level. Born in Kenya, educated at the University of Leeds and Glasgow, and honored with multiple awards and honorary degrees, she exemplifies the global leadership. In this conversation, we will explore the experiences and values that shaped her journey and gain her perspective on some of the most pressing issues of our time. Please join me in welcoming Baroness Usha Prashar.
I don't even know where to start. How do I even address you? Baroness Usha Prashar, very warm welcome to the Talk Lane. I am in awe of your aura, the work that you've done for past 5 decades, over 50 years. But even more importantly, I'm thoroughly honored that you agreed to do this with me. Given the fact that I already know on many levels from many people that you don't do this. You hate to talk about yourself. You hate to kind of put yourself in a position where you have to talk about everything great that you've done. And I'm exactly going to do that today. I'm going to make sure we get that story out of you. But thoroughly honored to have you on the show.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Anu. I think it must be your persuasive powers which have enticed me to actually have this conversation with you. But like you, I think many people are now saying to me that it's time you talked about it because other people need to hear the story and it's an inspiration. So I think I'm doing it not to promote myself, but I'm hoping that at least my story will inspire others.
Yes. Absolutely, yes. And I know this from a lot of people around. You like to maintain a very, very low profile. But when you talk about it, I know this from the people, from the women in my generation. We need to know your story so much in depth because it is so inspiring on so many levels. It is about a woman of color, immigrant, a woman in social services, in politics, from 60s and 70s where there's no concept of women working, let alone doing this and being trailblazer and breaking the glass ceiling. You are inspiration to so many on so many levels. And I think when I do this with you today, this podcast, it will leave a lot of women smiling ear to ear, giving them a sense of hope, inspiration, and a role model that they were always looking for, they couldn't find in many.
Well, let's see what you find, Eddie, by the end of the conversation.
Does that mean you're going to be a little cagey about it?
No, I will give you straightforward answers.
Amazing. So, I want to start with your childhood. You grew up in Kenya and you came to UK when you were 16. But what were those years in Kenya like? What was your childhood like? And I want to stop until that 16th year mark, just from like 0 to 16. What were those years like? What was your experience of growing in Kenya like?
My childhood in Kenya, on the whole, was a very happy experience. I am the youngest of six, but I came 11 years late. So I had five older siblings, and all five of them spoilt me because I was like the kind of the baby of the house. And also, I suppose, both my father and mother were very committed to the community service. My father was actively involved in the local Sanatan Dharam. You know, he was the president of Sanatan Dharam for a while, but also his commitment to social justice. I mean, my memory is when the Mau Mau movement started, the person who was our home servant was a Kikuyu. My father hid him so that he didn't get arrested. And my brother, who eventually called me here, I was very close to him. He was nearly 16 years older than me. And he would kind of take me around, read to me, you know what I mean? My brothers and sisters were very keen in terms of I read things. But I suppose very quietly until the age of 16, I imbibed those values of social justice. And I do remember, I think ours was probably the only dining table where I saw African members of the community sitting on the same table as us, because in Kenya, as you know, there was segregation, you know, although it wasn't apartheid, but there was very separate lives. But that really wasn't my experience. And my elder sister, in fact, she was very involved. She used to write short stories, and she was broadcasting them on Kenya Broadcasting Service, and she was in her own time quite a women's liberation. I mean, if she'd born in a different era, she would have been in a different place. So when I look back on it, I think those experiences and those values is something I actually imbibed. But I think I remember my brother, when he left to come and study here, he did say to my father, she's very intelligent, I think you should look after her. And he basically promised me, you know, when, you know, he would call me over to study. So I had all this desire to kind of, you know, study and so on. So basically, that's really what life was like. But it was around the community and very much involved through the institutions in the community that my father and mother were involved in.
So we don't want to disclose your age because firstly you look young, but this is like 75, 76 years ago in Kenya, which was a very, very different time.
It was now, it was 60 years this year that I came in 64.
Yeah.
And don't forget, it was a very different time. And I think you can see how my father's bravery, that is sending a girl of my age on her own to come and study. I think that in itself tells you that, you know, his desire. And he was someone who always kind of revered his daughters, do you know what I mean? Because, you know, there was no restrictions in terms of you can't do this, you can't do that. So I had a fairly liberal upbringing in that sense. But I think to some extent I was quite happy to leave Kenya because although the family was liberal, I think the community as a whole was rather inward looking, you know what I mean? The idea was, you know, once the girl's 16, 18, get her married and have children and all of that.
Yeah.
So it was very different, you know, for me. So I had all this, you know, great desire to kind of come away. So I was very glad that I had that opportunity.
Yeah. You spoke about Kenya in 50s, in 60s. I mean, I have lived in Kenya. I have family in Kenya. I have close ties with Kenya. But I know of Kenya of 80s and 90s, which is still, and of course from 2000s, because I was there about 8-10 years ago. How was it? How was it different back then? What was Kenya like of 50s and 60s?
As I said, I think it was a very divided community in the sense, you know, there was complete segregation, you know, because Kenya became independent December 1963. Although I saw the movement towards independence, but as you know, there were separate schools for Asians, separate schools for Africans, separate schools for whites. So in that sense, I suppose we were very happily self-contained communities. You know, it was a happy life in that sense. You know what I mean? There was a lot of community support and so on. But the communities were, I think, quite keen on their children being educated. And a lot of people were sending their children abroad to study either to India or the UK. I mean, the Kenya of now is, I mean, I haven't been back since 79 because I want to remember the way it was. It was a very green place, a very happy place. Now when I go back, I get quite distressed about Kenya, Nairobi and its state in terms of the potholes and all the poverty that I see around. But I think my memory of it is kind of, a happy childhood, very self-contained communities, but very little interaction between communities. So that's the way I remember it.
But your experience of people going to India and people coming here is something I'm very aware of. My mother had a lot of friends who studied with her, and they all came from Kenya. She studied in Mumbai, and there were a lot of people who came to India to study. I also know from my aunt's side, my mother's sister, she's married to an Indian in Kenya. So a lot of her family members, like from my uncle's side, came here to study. So there was a cross-cultural thing where they were trying to find that higher level of education either in India or in United Kingdom. And because at that point in time, I think this is pre-independence. Everyone kind of also inherited British passports. So from wherever they went to study, they still came back and then settled here. And I think a lot of them have flourished in United Kingdom, and they carry the strong roots of their Kenyan upbringing, but also very strong kind of traditional rooting in India, Indian, and kind of bringing that life here.
But I think your point about education, I mean, as you know, for Asian community, education was seen as a kind of the passport to progress. So I think the parents worked pretty hard to make sure that the children got educated. But I was very grateful that I got the opportunity to actually come here to study.
So youngest, most loved, pampered child comes to Wakefield at the age of 16. I think that was your first time when you came to UK, or you were visiting your brother earlier?
No, that was my first time. I left Kenya, as I say, for the first time. I ended up at Wakefield Girls High School because my brother by that time had qualified as a doctor, and he was a GP in a little village very near Wakefield. And so he was the one who made sure that I came, and I stayed with him and his wife, Brenda, who he married. He had 2 children. So I actually had a home to come to, but a very good school. And the Wakefield Girls High School, even though it was called the Direct Grant School. So that was really my sort of induction into UK. But I think what was very interesting from my point of view was that at the Wakefield Girls High School, I was the first overseas student, because I came here with the intention of going back. I came here for studies with the view to going back to Kenya. It wasn't here for settlement because my parents retired and went to India. So I just came to study with a view to going back. But being the overseas student, there was a great deal of curiosity about both life in Kenya, my culture. And so I think when you have been through your own cultural induction, you don't think about it. Whereas when the questions are being asked of me by girls in school about my culture, I had to explain to them. Which meant I actually took the time of going to the West Riding Library to read about Indian theatre, about Indian dance, Indian culture. So in a way, it was a self-education, so I was able to explain to them in some depth what my culture was like. So I think, again, that was very interesting way of actually, making me aware. And the other thing, which probably could say was the start of it, was my sister-in-law, Brenda, was a health visitor. In the 60s, when I came in 64, a lot of people were coming to that part of the world from Mirpur. Which is Pakistan. In Mirpur, Pakistanis were coming in. But they spoke Punjabi, which I do, of course. So I, at that age, would go around with her interpreting because she didn't speak the language. So I began to see what life was like for people, newcomers coming into this country, and the kind of difficulties they faced. So you can see kind of there's a dual thing here, this cool understanding and developing a deeper understanding, but at the same time seeing what life was like for other immigrants. But then I was struck with 2 tragedies, because having been here 2 years, my mother passed away. So, I didn't see my mother since after the age of 16. But my brother was killed in a car crash in 68. This was, I'd only been in the university for the first term. So which meant that I really had to grow up, having been pampered, and suddenly I had to grow up because my sister-in-law and I became quite close to each other, 2 children. So in that sense, that was kind of what you may call a quick sense of responsibility and maturing. And of course, in '68, the other thing that happened was some of the family came over from Kenya to London because of the Africanization policy in Kenya and the 1968 Immigration Act, whereas, they were changing the status of the Commonwealth citizens at that stage. So the 68 was a turmoil, so in the year. So that was the reason why I kind of had to change my course, and there was no way of going back to Kenya. So that tells you a little bit about the sort of, the first 4 years from 64 to 68, which were kind of the defining moments in one's life. And I went to Leeds to read politics and sociology and social administration was because Professor Henson, who was head of the department, was actually a specialist in international development, and he actually had contributed to write to the constitution of India, Nigeria, and in those days Burma. So it had a very good international relations department. But once I was there, because things changed, I changed tack and went on to do my postgraduate in social administration, and to some extent determined by all of that.
Yeah.
But the other thing I continued to do, having helped see migrants, when I came to Leeds University in '68, there was a campaign against racial discrimination that was being launched because there was a lot going on in terms of race relations. I became involved in that. But also at the same time, in my voluntary work, I was teaching English to newcomers in Leeds. So in terms of that work, so you can just see the way number of strands were beginning to fall into place.
Yeah. A couple of things. I obviously know what happened in 1968 with the Immigration Act and etc. Many people wouldn't know. Would you mind telling us what had happened in terms of the Immigration Act and between Kenya and UK and how things were changing?
But it wasn't just Kenya and UK. See, what it was basically, it was mildly, by making complicated, there was a view that, if you're a British passport holder, you could come here. So the change was that if you were in the colony, your right to come here would be restricted. And that led to an exodus of a different kind from Kenya in '68.
Yeah. My uncle still holds Kenyan passport. He's one of these people who did not come. And I'm sure that was the case with many Africans at that point, or many Kenyans at that point in time. They thought this is where they belonged. So a lot of them were like, we okay not getting the British passport, we okay not coming to UK ever, but we want to stay back here and call this home. But like you said, there were a lot of people who were in that frenzy at that point in time that probably the doors were closing, so they just wanted to make the shift. And if I remember it correctly, there was also a little bit of fear because at that point in time, it was, I think, the beginning of the rise of Idi Amin. And there was a lot of rhetoric that it might just lead to mass exodus for us one point in time. We'll have nowhere to go.
I think it was the uncertainty, of course, the fear of the unknown. And the Africanization policy and the nationalization of some of the industries meant that people were uncertain which direction to go. So people didn't want to have the doors closed as such.
Yeah. And then there was this whole rush of having to come here. So your plans of probably eventually one day wanting to move back was thrashed out of nowhere. And that must have put you in a lurch and you'd be like, now where? Like, of course, losing a parent is one of the hardest experiences, and at such a young and a impressionable age that leaves such a void.
But also my brother, who I was very close to.
Exactly, right? So that's like a father figure you've lost, a mother you've lost. And suddenly you are in this new culture, new place, which is to some extent you're just getting acclimatized to. This is not home as yet. And that must have had such a deep impression on your mind.
I think it did have a deep impression, but I think it kind of builds your resilience. And I suppose, I don't know, when I look back on it, I think I'm always grateful for the fact that I had the support structures. My sister-in-law was absolutely wonderful. She's 90 now. She's my go-to person.
Wow.
Brenda is absolutely wonderful. So I had a support structure. My school, I know people talk about it, but my school headmistress, she died at the age of 102. She kept in touch with me until she died.
Wow.
And because she retired to Godalming, which was near where I lived. And so I had a wonderful school support system. And then I feel at a university, the friends and so on. So I think to some extent you create your support structures, but that maturity emerges, and that here I am. I've got to sort of somehow survive, and I think it did make me grow up.
Yeah.
At a young age of 18, 19, I maybe developed an greater sense of responsibility.
Yeah, but it was also, you touched upon explaining the girls what their culture is, what Indian culture is. So I know that happens to a lot of us when we come from a different country and then we go to another country, but it's not really India. And there's a lot of question asked about India. And the girls, my friends, I or many other people, they're confused about what their identity is. Are we Kenyan? Are we Indian? What culture are we coming and representing in this class full of, multicultural amalgamation?
I didn't have any doubt. I mean, I knew I'm Indian, although I was born in Kenya.
Yeah.
But the culture, as you well know, in Kenya was, very Indian. We were brought up as Indians. I mean, I had no doubt about my identity as such. But I suppose it got me thinking quite deeply about, what were the things, that I had imbibed unconsciously. How do I explain them,
But had you gone to India in those 16 years?
I had only once.
See, that's what. So you knew you were Indian.
Yeah, of course.
But not really in India.
No, I mean, I still feel Indian. I go to India. But I think if I look back on it, I mean, to me, being an Indian isn't really about religion and your rituals and all of that. I think my Indian identity is rooted in the values which were imparted. And because I look at Indian culture in terms of its spirituality, not religion, I make that difference, And therefore, I think it's those values which I feel are the ones, because if you look at it, the fact there's a freedom in terms of religion, you can worship whatever God you wish to, there's pluralism. There is no restriction, you can't do this or you can't do that. You know what I mean? It's something you feel, it's more a way of life.
Yeah.
It is that, I think, which defines me.
Yeah.
As an Indian.
As you spoke about your relationship with your sister-in-law who's in her 90s, with your mistress who was 102 years old and kept in touch.
Both white, English?
Yeah, and that is like a very core of an Indian value, like the rootedness in keeping relationships close, in keeping people close to some extent.
Well, I think it's partly them as much as me. I mean, the point really is, you see, to me, when I look at those two women who influenced me a lot, their values were no different to mine, because I think we can exaggerate differences. Now, when I went to Yorkshire, what I liked about it, I mean, it was the family values, right? And it's the fact that, there is honesty, there's integrity. I mean, she could have easily said, well, your brother's died, I have nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course.
But the point was, it's the family values, right? So I think we can somehow exaggerate the differences. So if you go beyond and you begin to see what people are like, you'll find it's not all that different. I mean, I recently kind of downsized and I was looking at some of the old papers and I came across a letter which my headmistress wrote to my brother, because when I left school, he must have thanked her. And she wrote a letter, and in fact, I was taken aback, because when I looked at it, and she wrote that in 1967, when I was about 18, 19, and in that letter, she says that she was struck by my maturity and my appreciation of the opportunities that I had, right? So, which made me realize something must have been there innate, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, it's not just me. And I think, to me, as I said, to me, the people I have met, maybe it's the aura you exude, it's the relationship you form, regardless. And I always say to people, you can create barriers by thinking, I'm a woman, I'm an Asian woman, my culture is different, whereas just think of you as a person, right?
Yeah.
And if you do that, you can strike very good relationships.
This is such a high level of maturity at such a young age.
I mean, I don't know where it came from, but it was there.
Yeah. So obviously this is we've only covered like just 20 years of your life, but it was as if so much that happened in those 20 years.
Those are formative years.
Very formative years, of course. And in very different circumstances, very changing circumstances. You said you were studying at Leeds. and you decided to study public service, public administration.
Well, and I was doing politics and sociology, but my postgraduate was in Glasgow in public administration.
But, and again, you spoke about it. At your time, women got married at 16 and 18, and many of them wouldn't have thought of doing politics and, sociology or public service or government and these things. Like, what piqued your interest in topics like this?
I think partly, as I say, was the experience. So what I'd seen Kenya come through independence, and I followed the independence and the decolonization very closely. Then when I began to see, what was actually going on, and I think my brother had quite a bit of influence. I mean, when I first came, he said to me, there are three things you got to read. Got to read The Observer and The Guardian, Daily Telegraph, because it's good on international relations, not for his politics. But he made sure in those days, New Statesman was a really good magazine. He would make me read the New Statesman, and he would sit and sort of discuss with me what was in it. So I just became very interested in society, in change, and I've never been I don't like injustice of any kind. Then I began to see what's happening in terms of race relations in this country. So I just thought that, it'd be good to do something in terms of public policy and social administration where one could actually make a difference. You're right, a lot of people were saying to me, why are you doing this? Because the usual thing, you should be doing medicine or something. I mean, the kind of the usual Indian stuff came. But,
Yeah.
and I think Leeds for me, again, was a very interesting university because, it was in the swinging 60s. It was a very left-wing university, very dynamic, but very international. It had a really good English department. I mean, though it wasn't my department. And people like Solevianka Ngugi, one of the African authors, they were all there, you know what I mean? So actually, the whole atmosphere, very, very different. And also, my degree was such that in the second year there was no exams. It was studied through tutorials, which suited my temperament because it was through discourse, dialogue. And I was very interested in political philosophy, so it just kind of came.
It just came along.
It just came along.
So what happened after you graduated?
Well, after Leeds, I went to Glasgow University to do my postgraduate. And I did social administration. There's another twist to this, because what had happened is that they published what they called the Kilbrandon Report, which was really about community development, how you bring probation and social services together and so on. And Scotland was always used kind of a guinea pig for these new ideas. So I went to Glasgow to do social administration. And again, I suppose I was lucky because my tutor there was a wonderful woman called Kay Carmichael. She was in her own right very interesting. She had done work with women in prisons, and she'd gone and lived in the Gorbals on social security and wrote about what it was like to live on, £5 and sixpence a week by, people and so on. And Glasgow in those days, as you know, there was coming down of the old tenement blocks and so on. But the course was such that they would have made me go towards the line of becoming a social worker. And I said to Kay, look, I'm not cut out to be a social worker. I want to do things which will make me change the system. I said, I can't go into a kind of a woman who's living in poverty, say to her how to live on £5, sixpence, you know what I mean? I need to change that. And she was very good, and she said, fine, you can do your dissertation on community development. So then I did my piece of work my dissertation was on looking at two areas. One was just outside Dumbarton, the Bellsmire estate, which was a white working class, very deprived estate, which was kind of literally encased by three kind of motorways. The other was what in those days called the sort of twilight area in Glasgow itself, where again a lot of immigrants were coming, other people were leaving, and older people left behind, so there was kind of tensions emerging. So basically I did some practical community work and wrote my dissertation. And that gave me again an understanding of that some of the issues facing deprived white communities are not all that different, although there's a racial dimension to all of that. So that was really but again, my interest in race relations really started there. And there's one story I'd love to tell you because it sort of left a mark on me. Because one summer, part of my dissertation, I organised a summer project in this twilight area in Glasgow, where again there were a lot of new migrants coming in, but old people were kind of, the white Glaswegians were feeling ostracised. So, and I organised this project in summer, for children to come together. And I found this old lady, I still remember her name, Miss Buchanan. She was good at making woolen toys. Mm-hmm. So I said to her, would she mind coming to the church and teaching children how to make woolen toys? Mm. And because she was living on a third floor on her own, quite frightened to go out because, the area around was dingy. Oh. So she basically said she would. And suddenly she was teaching young Pakistani children how to make woolen toys. Through that, she developed relationships with them, right? Mm. After the project finished, they would go to her home, do her shopping, and suddenly she was able to walk in the street, and she was walking the street, they would run behind Miss Buchanan, Miss Buchanan. So you see, when you see things like that, you can see how you can actually break barriers. These are anecdotal stories, but that give you a bigger story in terms of how we actually can work on creating divisions. Mm. And if you understand it at human level, you can break those barriers.
Yeah, this is such a powerful story.
I mean, I just remember to this day.
Yeah, this is such a powerful story. Mm. And you're right. It is, I think, the fear of unknown, the unfamiliarity, the stereotypes that we carry about a lot of cultures, about a lot of people, and then unless we have kind of known them personally, up close and personal, it doesn't go. And that's what the whole point is. How do we get to the point of breaking those barriers and bringing people and culture together?
Yeah, I mean, that is not to suggest there isn't structural discrimination or racism or, gender discrimination there, but it's really how we deal with it, what I'm really concerned about.
Yeah.
But I think also the other thing, by comparing these two areas, I mean, this is something which you'll see as you come later into my career, is very much how you actually work collectively within the system to bring a change, rather than having sort of separate strands, which actually contributes to divisions rather than bringing people together.
Yeah, very fair point. So you finish your dissertation, you graduate, and then what was the path forward for you? Did they say like, okay, now you've done whatever you wanted to do, it's time for you to get married, time for you to settle down, forget everything?
I don't think my family, because my father was in India, my elder brother who was in London, so I mean there was no pressure on me as such, what I mean? And I suppose by all my life I've been quite independent, and they knew that I always had my own mind, what I really wanted. And I was very focused on my career and where I wanted to make a difference. And it wasn't career for success or career for making money. I've always been motivated career in terms of how I can make a difference. So after all this, that's when I thought, no, I want to work in race relations, right? So I came down to London, and all my working life has been in London. And I sort of took a temporary job by looking for 3 months with the then CRC, it was the Commission for Racial Equality. And I did a temporary job in the library. Again, I studied a lot for 3 months. Then I applied. And my first job was as the Assistant Conciliation Officer with the then Race Relations Board. This was a board set up following the 1968 Race Relations Act, which was the first act to deal with discrimination. And my job was to work on the discrimination in goods and services, but also to investigate complaints against government departments, but to get the cases ready for court where conciliation had failed. So I did that for about 5 years, 72 to 76, And the two significant things I did there were, I think, worth mentioning to you. One was the investigation into busing. Now, people don't realize that busing existed in the UK. Now, you look surprised.
Yeah.
Because in 1965, Edward Boyle, who was then the education minister, went to Southall, and all the white parents complained that the influx of Asians is lowering the standards, so they decided that they will bus children. So busing was introduced in the UK in 1965.
Oh.
So in about 1970, 71, no, 72, 73, look back how long it is. We decided the investigation should be done. Is this policy discriminatory? But the difference was that the then Act said that you can only investigate if someone complains. You cannot, as the Race Relations Board, initiate a complaint. But there was a section there, Section 11, I remember, where you could initiate if you felt that there was something systematic. So I basically decided that this investigation must be done, with, of course, the blessing of my bosses at that time. And I remember walking street by street in Southall, taking statements from parents about how children had to get up so early, be bussed into outer areas, what a long day it was for 5, 6-year-olds. To cut a long story short, I worked with a very, very good barrister, Lord Anthony Lester, and he was the kind of the counsel. And we appointed Professor Kogan as a kind of the education consultant. But the kind of long story short, we actually managed to get that case and done and the busing dismantled. So that happened in about 72, 73. So people are surprised that there was busing here. They all think of busing in America.
Yeah, that's what I also thought.
And then the other investigation was, again, into patterns of housing policy. Neom Council at that time introduced a policy that if anybody who was on the Housing Council list, if they left the country for more than a certain amount of time, they would fall back on the queue. This would indirectly discriminate against immigrants who were habit of going home for a long period. So that was another investigation. So basically, that's really the two things which I would just highlight. But the other thing I would highlight about that is that by doing complaints against government departments, it gave me a good understanding of how government works in terms of the way policies are developed and the sort of insight into government machinery. So when they passed the 1976 Race Relations Act, which was again the work of Anthony Lester and co. As you remember, they abolished the Race Relations Board and the OCRC and formed a single organization, Commission for Racial Equality. And I was then asked, almost headhunted, to become an assistant director of the Runnymede Trust.
Yes.
And that was because while this legislation was going through Parliament, it was basically to make sure, like I see do now, at the committee stage, you give briefings to MPs and all of those. So that was the work I did at Runnymede Trust as an assistant director. And then within about, I think, a year or just so, I became the director at the age of 28. And that was quite a tough period because there was a view that now that they had this big Commission for Racial Equality, there wasn't a need for the Runnymede Trust because it was a charitable, independent, it was a charity. But just going back, I may tell you a little bit about the genesis of Runnymede Trust. Because Runnymede Trust was established in 1968 by a group of very enlightened, very dynamic group of people. Jim Rose, who had done Colour and Citizenship Report, Anthony Lester, Lord Campbell of Ascon. They were all men, but they were Sir Peter Medawar, who's a Nobel Prize winner, because after Enoch Powell made his Bloods of River speech, they felt there was a need for an organization like the Runnymede Trust, which would do public education on race relations, and it will be evidence-based. So that's one. And his first director actually was Deepak Nande. And I was the third or the fourth director, because I became director in 1976, I think. I'm losing track of time. So that's really what the Runnymede Trust was. So when I joined, there was a view, well, Commission for Ratio had been formed, there's no need for it, you know what I mean? So it was a small organization, although it sounds like a big organization. It's a very small organization. It had only about 10, 12 people working for it. And my job really was to kind of do the work, but also raise money for it. And I spent 1976 to 84 as its director at a very critical time.
Yeah.
I should stop there. You can ask me a question because I'm to give you a whole history.
No.
I'm in
This
full
is exactly
flow.
what is needed. I think this is such an interesting history that not many people know of, that they don't know how it was formed, why it is, why it came into being. So this was very, very interesting point. But this brings me to, so because we're looking a lot in the history and just reflecting on that in the current times, So since your time with Runnymede Trust, the UK has made strides in addressing racial discrimination, yet significant challenges remain, right? And I mean, we know that a lot has been done in this space, and I say this as someone who lives in the United States and who comes from India. I know that in so many ways, UK and EU is looked upon as a poster child for driving racial equality on so many levels, right? But we know in the recent times, with the way things have happened post Brexit, things do not look the same, especially with the new rise in the number of immigrants that this country has welcomed to some extent. From the time that you were dealing with this very grassroots levels, today when I think about it, I was like, oh my God, this is even exist? Like, was it really like, even when we know this sounds like a distant dream, right? What?
Well, I mean, I think it's important, if I may just go back a bit, before I answer that question, I think there's something I need to tell you about me in terms of my transition, because I think that will have relevance to my answer to this question. When I was at Runnymede Trust, as you know, the Brixton uprisings took place, the Scarman Report. And with a lot we did in terms of both legislation, the Nationality Act, the media reporting, and the work I did at Runnymede Trust was quite significant in terms of some of the changes that you see today. So a lot in the detail to go through, but as you asked me to talk about it, I could talk about it at length, but we won't. But one thing I realized at that stage, I realized that I could not make the difference I wanted to make unless I mainstreamed myself, because a view was emerging. This is the race relations industry. I'd been Race Relations Board, Runnymede Trust, although a highly respected organization. So I thought the way I could shift things, I had to mainstream myself. So I took 2 years out and became a fellow at the Policy Studies Institute. And I did a piece of work on primary health care, wrote a big book with Professor Ken Young and Gerald Rhodes. But it was really, again, to compare how you actually shift organizations and institutions, because I thought that's really where change had to happen. So it was to compare the Scarman Report implementation, with that. So those 2 years was really a kind of, quite an interesting understanding the system, which I'd already begun to understand. But I had this conviction from my work in Glasgow, in my dissertation, the work I did with government departments, Runnymede, that you had to kind of bring these things into the center, because when you talk about changes. So those 2 years was kind of getting, and then I became, this was a big breakthrough, was in 1984, when I left Runnymede for 2 years, in 86, I was appointed the first woman chief executive of the National Council for Voluntary Organizations. Now, this in some ways was quite a breakthrough, because one, that organization was about 50 years old, it never had a woman director. It was very much, rural community councils and quintessentially British in that sense. But when I got it, I think it sent a signal. I mean, to this day, I've got a pile of letters I got from minority women and men and others to say, look, this is a real breakthrough. If you can do it, we can do it. So I think it's by that example. Now, to me, the importance of voluntary action building your own resilience, taking action to bring change was quite important, right? So I think that shift is when I began to mainstream myself and work through institutions. Now, your question, I think, you're right. I think the trajectory of Britain in terms of what it's been trying to do, it's certainly better than, when you compare it to other countries. There's no two ways about it. Because, as I said, although there's been whinging about immigration, numbers game, as we used to call it, firm but fair, but at least those who are here should be treated properly.
Yeah.
In my view, I think the debates here where probably has kind of slightly gone askew about the misunderstanding of multiculturalism and multiracial debate. Because I think people have taken the meaning of multiculturalism into these excesses. In my book, yes, like I say, I'm very proud to be an Indian. I maintain my culture, but at the same time, you got to kind of integrate and begin to understand the norms of the society you're working in. But I think what's happened is we've seen this what I call balkanization of communities. It's got rather entrenched in that sense. So people somehow think multiculturalism is almost kind of separate lives, So I think that has, to some extent, has skewed the kind of debate we've had there. Then it's got complicated with the whole issue of immigration. And also people do conflate immigration with refugees, right? Sometimes it's willful. And I think then what happened kind of, post-11, the rise of Islamophobia. So I think all these factors have contributed to kind of rather complexity of the situation.
And so this is a very fair point, right? It's not just one single point of reasoning. It is a combination of many factors, as you mentioned. But do you think, how does it place UK to some extent to deal with this, with its rich history of, even the very white male British who have fought for the rights for racial indiscrimination or racial justice, racial equality? There's obviously rich history of that. There's also rich culture of that. And in current time, with everything that you mentioned, how is UK positioned to deal with it? Does a lot remain to be done in this space, or you think it is on track to some extent?
I think you've got to be constantly vigilant. You can't be complacent because, as I said, there is a level of structural racism in institutions. There are kind of views which are now becoming more vocal. One has seen a lot more expression of that. You only got to see the relationship between the minority communities and the police. You've just got to see, what's happening, particularly in terms of school, because although Indian kids are doing well, there is still a real issue in terms of expulsion of the Afro-Caribbean kids and so on, and to some extent the Bangladeshi community as well. So I think there are issues which have to be dealt with. My question is how do we deal with it? And that's why, from the public policy point of view, my view is while you've got to segment what are the specific issues facing different communities, and that doesn't exclude white working class communities, there's the issue of social mobility there. How do you develop policies that is access and opportunity for everybody, right? So I think that's really where, the debate is. A lot more is talked about all of that. And I think it was easier when there was a problem discrimination. Look, this is the problem. What to do about it has become more complex because, and this is tied up, of course, with what's happened economically, what's happened about populism, what's happened about Brexit. So there's a number of issues, layer upon layer, which has made this very complex. And I think that requires a very thoughtful approach to some of these issues. And I personally think that while you recognize where the pockets of the problems are, in terms of what you do with it, it's got to be made integral to your overall policy, not as a kind of a separate issue.
Yeah.
Some may not agree with me, but I think that ultimately, if you want to really make a difference, and if I have to sit somewhere, because, maybe this is my personal passion, I think we've got to see how institutions operate, and you've got to deal with institutional practices, policies, and cultures to bring about the change, where you've got to begin to look at how do you make sure there's opportunities for people within it. Because what what COVID highlighted was the plight of the minority communities working in the National Health Service,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Now, so when you begin to see the gender pay gap, the racial pay gap, that begins to highlight where the problems really are.
Yeah.
So I think you've really got to persevere on that.
Yeah.
So therefore one can't be complacent. You've got to really kind of identify, get those things accepted, and make sure action is taken.
Yeah.
And I think you just cannot take your eye off the ball.
So, but that also means, in summary, a very strong policy infrastructure that needs to be in the place. And in some ways, it is kind of building it from grassroots level. Because like you mentioned, the problems are not very simple as they used to be. You cannot isolate it. Now it is more compounded, more complex, more kind of closely tied in a way that it is difficult to separate each of it out and dissect it individually and have a solution for each of it. It is not, like you rightly said. So that means that there has to be a very, very strong push for a stronger policy infra that can kind of rejig it to some extent.
Well, I think in a way that's the crux of the matter, because when the current Prime Minister talks about fixing the foundations, you know what I mean? Because that's right. I mean, there are some very entrenched problems.
Yeah.
And that's going to require a great deal of kind of, hard grind, to
Yes.
basically change all of that.
Yes.
And that requires, I think, certain resilience, certain maturity of approach, right?
Yeah.
And so it is actually complex.
Yes. This is something I kind of think about a lot. I talk about this a lot with my friends. I think sometimes I feel, or correct me if I'm wrong, or what are your thoughts rather? Do you think it is peril of democracy? Because what happens is when we want to make such a huge change, when we are kind of building things from foundation again, which means it is a really big jolt to the system. And in a democracy where there is class division also to some extent, it is very hard to bring about that change because people do not like change. If it is going to impact their life even by a small bit, they're resistant to change. And hence it makes very difficult to have these drastic measures laid out.
I don't think it's just democracy. I think you've got to look at social media as well. And I think what's happened with social media is that people have lost the art of having a nuanced debate. You get these echo chambers, and everybody has a viewpoint, and people are looking for short-termism. So I think that is a factor. And the other thing which I also feel is that we don't have the kind of leadership, or haven't had for a while, where leaders lead from up front. They lead to follow. And in my book, to be a good leader, you've got to know when to follow and when to lead.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I think this 24/7 news coverage, short memories, populism, and issues, interest of migration. So it's not an easy thing to actually do, but it calls for strong leadership.
But what happens in democracies to some extent is a populism drive. Like your vote bank is driven by whatever is the popular opinion out there, right? That makes it sometimes tricky for a leader to drive a very unpopular opinion and just have like kind of, you said, lead from front, because to lead you need a lot of support as well. Isn't that like kind of the beauty and the peril of democracy?
Yeah, I'm not thinking it's a power of democracy. I mean, what I'm saying is knowing when to lead and when to follow. And I think in my experience, people do respond to strong leadership. And also, if you're able to be honest with the public, because the tendency is that you make promises which you cannot keep, right? That destroys trust, right? And good governance, I feel very strongly about. Good governance is quite important in terms of building trust as well. And I mean, it's giving you an example, but I always give the example of Relations Act was passed in '68. Dockers were marching. There was not a public, in favor of it, right? But Roy Jenkins then sort of said, look, this is the right thing to do, right? So that's what I meant, knowing when to have leadership and when to follow public opinion. But these days, I think we get this segmentation. We will say, well, we will do this for this to get this vote, and we will do to get that vote, right? But having done that, it doesn't deal with some of the fundamental problems. And where I think democracy is in peril, because people recognize that democracy plus globalization hasn't quite contributed to equity and equality of opportunity in that sense. So people are falling into the hands of the populist kind of fervor. So as I said, we are and I think this is really where we've got to begin to work with younger people to get them to understand. And I personally feel we've got to make sure that we use the social media for positive purposes. Is how do we create a marketplace of ideas where it can be used to create a dialogue rather than an echo chamber.
That makes sense. So you have been, that brings me to my next question, because we're on the line of Brexit and multiculturalism and immigration. You've been a chair of Judicial Appointments Commission, advocating for diversity within judiciary, and your work has consistently focused on fostering inclusive societies. And we are on the topic of inclusive societies, right? How do you see the multiculturalism and social cohesion evolve in the United Kingdom? Do you think that whatever we have done in the past and whatever we're dealing with currently, does it make any kind of foundation, or even just like, does it strike any kind of debate for us to think about social cohesion and multiculturalism on a larger level? Do you think we are poised for that from a society's perspective?
I think that's a really good question, because my point earlier about how multiculturalism to some extent contributed to balkanization, but I think what we really want is social cohesion. And I think people are beginning to realize, how do we build social cohesion? And nothing was more evident about that since the recent riots we had in July, past the election. That it's really, and the social cohesion means that while you respect differences, you've got to get people together on some of the common issues. How do you actually build communities? And given my background in terms of great belief in community development and bringing communities together around issues, so I think maybe the pendulum, as my views, maybe spun too far on terms of multiculturalism, which is beginning to affect social cohesion. And that's really where I think, while we respect multiculturalism, we respect people's differences and their different perspectives, right? But there has to be something in society which brings us together. And now I think the time has come where whether you are black, white, man, woman, you are concerned about good education, good housing, good communities, So in that sense, I think we've got to begin to look at what are the issues which will bring us together, bring social cohesion. And my hope is that this government's push towards kind of devolving power locally will be used to actually build communities and social cohesion and bring people together in a much more of a meaningful way, but not just in a kind of a superficial interactions.
Wealth is most often one of the most contentious point of debate, and it can go either in favor or against social cohesion most often, right? So the recent ONS data shows that top 10% of UK households hold more wealth than bottom 50%, right? Do you think that kind of goes against the idea of bringing people together, or kind of building a socially cohesive society? You think that the wealth gap sometimes becomes the biggest reason as to why we cannot bring cultures and people together?
I think there has been a debate here, what they call the levelling up debate. And it's levelling up really among regions, but making sure that there is sort of equity, in terms of access. I mean, I think it'd be too idealistic to say that, that you won't have the rich and the poor, but to make sure that the gap isn't such that you create a politics of envy. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
that's why I think we need strategies which make sure that you actually build areas. And again, one of my hobby horses has been, and this happened, post-Scarman, what happened was when there were riots, what the government did was actually gave money to communities, you know what I mean, to build. Whereas my idea was they should give money to areas. Because if you gave to the area which was deprived, it brought communities together. If you gave it to a single community, you actually created a greater division. So I think the idea of levelling up and building societies, whether it's on question of health and housing, because housing is a big issue for everybody, whether you're black or white. So I think we need to have policies which actually begins to kind of reduce the gap, and we have better equity, where people feel that they've got the fair share. Because all this contributes then to bad health, immortality rates, school aspirations. I mean, poverty creates all the problems. Therefore, you've got to deal with these issues, and to have that kind of cohesion, you've got to kind of bring communities together, so you're all working together for society as a whole, not just for sectional interests.
That makes complete sense. I think if there is reimagination of how we go about empowering communities, or how we go about bridging the
I may
wealth
be too
gap.
idealistic, but that's really what I do
No,
strongly believe.
I agree with you. Like, instead of kind of empowering one particular community, if we look at it as an area to, and then go after that area to bridge the wealth gap, it'll probably kind of move us away from the focus or attention that we have, which is divisive community act, versus kind of like a very bringing people together. Obviously, it makes a huge difference, and I completely agree with you. You were talking about your role at Runnymede, and then how you went on to be about the CEO of the board of
National Council Volunteer
yes.
Organization. Yeah.
And so what happens after that? This is still an interesting journey to your career. What happens after that?
After the National Council Volunteer Organizations, I kind of took time out to do various other things. And during that period, I did the Lord Chancellor's Advisory Committee on Legal Education and Conduct, which was quite seminal in the sense it was about looking at the broader legal education and the rights of audience for solicitors. I did the Royal Commission on Criminal Justice, which was quite an influence on how the criminal justice system has actually evolved. And I also got involved in some of the refugee policy, so I did a range of things. But then I was appointed as the executive chairman of the Parole Board of England and Wales. And that again was kind of a breakthrough, because for the first time it was through open competition, and I was the first woman. And then I became the first Civil Service Commissioner, which was about ensuring the impartiality of the civil service and making sure that the appointments to the civil service are fair and open on merit, because the whole idea of the Civil Service Commission was to ensure that it remains impartial, which, as you know, is very much the kind of the bedrock of the way this country operates. So you can see the Parole Board was my kind of continuing interest in the criminal justice system. And civil service was again partly continuing into machinery of government and so on. And then after that I became the inaugural chair of the Judicial Appointments Commission. And that was, again, quite a significant constitutional change, because prior to that, judges were appointed, what they call tap on the shoulder, you know what I mean? The Lord Chancellor said, will you become a chair, will you become a judge? And then there was a view that if judges had to be legitimate, there had to be transparency, but also to widen the pool from which the judges are drawn, not just minorities and women, but also solicitors could become judges as well. So I set that up, which was again another constitutional thing. And during the course of that, I was appointed to the Iraq inquiry.
Yeah.
And then I also did other things like the Royal Commission. I mean, I did the Royal Commonwealth Society. I was its chair for a while. I set up the National Literacy Trust. It was in 1992, which was on literacy. And I was then deputy chair of the British Council. So I've done a whole range of things during the course of my life.
Yeah.
But it's all been, there's a thread, which is about public policy, about justice, about culture, connecting people, and so on.
Yeah. I'm going to pull that one single thread from a lot of amazing things that you've done, and this is obviously about the Iraq inquiry. Before I get into asking questions about Iraq inquiry, do you want to tell our audience what Iraq inquiry was and why was it formed?
So the Iraq inquiry was set up to look into in terms of finding out what exactly happened and what lessons could be learned. So it was an inquiry not about apportioning blame or looking at legality, but to see what happened and what lessons could be learned.
So it was more about accountability for the sitting Prime Minister at that point in time and the government in power.
It was not so much accountability, it was establishing what happened and what lessons could be learned so that people knew why it happened, how it happened, and how you ensure that it didn't happen again. One thing to say about that inquiry, it was a tough assignment, but I think it tells you something about British democracy and its strength. The fact a country can open itself up to do that level of inquiry shows that it is at one level a pretty robust inquiry. In the same way, they've set up the inquiry into COVID. These inquiries are quite important in that sense. What was very important, why I was interested again, because given my interest in machinery of government, it was more about how the decision was taken, what was the relationship between America and UK, and the role of the United Nations. From that point of view, it was a very interesting insight into how the decisions were made, and the fact that that report was published kind of put an end to any controversy, about whether it was legal, not legal, what had happened, and so on. I found it quite tough, but I think it was an important inquiry. And I'm at one level very proud of myself and my colleagues, called the Chilcot Inquiry. So John Chilcot was the chairman, and my other colleagues worked pretty hard. And we did the inquiry from 1910, it was about 6-7 years. Although there was a controversy why it took so long, but it's like writing a thesis, you're writing about, a period of 6-7 years, and you're getting into depth and writing about it. That was quite an important piece of work.
Yeah.
And service to the community as such.
Yeah.
The society,
What were the key findings from that inquiry, and what were some of the lessons that you think the future governments learned?
That's a difficult question to answer in a short space of time, because it's a pretty long and pretty complex. From my point of view, the biggest lessons really were from my point of view, was about the machinery of government, how decisions are made, what should be the role of the cabinet, and the division between the advice given by civil servants, what should be the role of the special services, and so on and so forth. It's quite complex in that sense, and the role of government departments. What happens about reconstruction, once you've actually been in the war, how reconstruction happens, because all these are very complex. The other thing really is, from my point of view, recognizing that you cannot impose democracies in other countries,
Yeah.
There are some quite deep, complex lessons to be learned.
Yeah. This is, I in particular asked about it because the way the macro geopolitical environment is right now, this is a very, very crucial question when we speak about inquiries and accountability. Do you think today's polarized climate, not just like at home, but even globally, the environment it is, we're becoming increasingly divisive, and I think that has to do with the way the wealth gap is driving this whole division. Do you think in today's this current polarized environment, we're undermining accountability, or you think there's a room for progressive standards of leadership in a world that increasingly favors pragmatism over ideals?
Right, that's a big question. I think, to me, the polarization and the populism is because of, I think, the weakening of liberal democracies. And I also think this is partly about that the liberal democracies became rather complacent. They thought, this is it, and this is how the world is going to be, and we can actually do that. But that the liberal democracies did not deliver the promise of equity. And people who felt left behind have tended to fall into the hands of the populists and so on. So there's that dimension. This, as I say, to some extent, exacerbated by the technological social media and so on. The popular leaders, the populist leaders, kind of give easy answers, slogans, which appeal to people. And people think there are solutions to this, like, for example, get Brexit done, make America great, you know what I mean? All these snappy things, simplistic things people fall for. But I don't think we can say that the people who've been pushing liberal democracies are not at fault, because in a way became very complacent and took that things for granted. The other thing which I think happening is the political shift that's taking place. You are getting, of course, the rise of some of the, the developing economies. You see the rise of China, the rise of India, and of course, the BRICS, the formation of it, and you're getting a certain assertiveness from people. And I think the West, to some extent, and I think probably Iraq war did contribute to that, and the way they've behaved, are losing their moral authority and ability to see themselves the policemen of the world. So I think there are a number of factors at play, which is kind of contributing. And if you look at the recent elections, you know what I mean, the Democrats in America couldn't take the vote of the black communities for granted. There's kind of a shift and so on. And why that is the case, because people are beginning to feel the pinch. And this goes to my earlier point, that it's not just about being black or being a woman. Ultimately, what matters to people is their livelihood, their opportunities, and they want to feel they got a fair share. And I think it's that what we need to concentrate on as much. But I think the fact of the social media is that we're not able to have nuanced debate anymore. And as you said earlier yourself, that people tend to now look for short-term answers, short-term cures. They're playing to the gallery to stay in power. So all of that is contributing. And I think in my book, we don't have what I call sort of strong visionary leaderships.
Yeah, I agree with that. That couple of points that I have always strongly felt about. One is like a huge policy infra shift that needs to happen with few of the world's largest democracy, because it's, to some extent, it is rotten. To some extent, it is decaying, and it needs a whole new rejigging. It needs very strong leadership, but on the ground, it also needs people's choice of being progressive over practical. And the practicalism actually, to me, stems from the very divisive nature and the wealth gap that we spoke about. Like, if you are starving, you're not going to think about the value system. You're going to think about, like you said, the livelihood. And I used to think that this is a big problem for democracies which are which have very strong root of capitalism. But it doesn't seem to be the case now. It seems like this is a global problem as opposed to just a few economies problem. And I think when we look at it from that lens, it is a very, very strong threat to democracy. And democracy, as we know of today, is unlikely to exist unless we see a complete breakdown of the system, and then people would then want to vote for the change that they think can really make their life better.
Yeah, I mean, I think you answered your own question to some extent, but I'm not sure what gives me hope, because if you look at the election in India, democratic processes work. I just heard this morning there's been an election in Mauritius. I think there's a change there. In America, whatever you may say, democracy has worked. I mean, people have actually spoken, because I think what you got to go beyond, why did they vote the way they did, is to understand that, right? And I think we tend to go much more for the personality rather than the reasons underneath. We're very quick to jump and sort of say it's the individual, whereas I think there needs to be a much more kind of considered analysis of what are the changes taking and what does that actually mean for those people who want to protect liberal democracy.
Yeah.
I mean, democracy, nobody said is perfect, but it's probably the best system that we have.
Yeah.
And therefore to make it work.
Yeah.
But to some extent, I think excesses of democracy has also, we've kind of distorted the way democracy works.
Yeah.
And one of the things I feel, at least in the UK, people tend to think of democracy as that you go and vote and that's democracy. To my mind, democracy is much more about participation.
Yeah.
You've got to engage people, right? And I always say that we've got to have strategies with young people where you deepen democratic behaviors.
Yeah.
Now, the democratic behaviors are inculcated in schools, right? In engagement, in participation, right? Whereas we do not actually spend time. We somehow think I voted and therefore it is my lifelong right for the government to provide for me. Whereas to my mind, we have kind of lost sight of democratic behaviors and participation in democratic processes other than just voting.
Yeah, but I think it also is rooted in the social security that a nation can provide. When someone has to really worry about how they're going to make the ends meet, they're not going to think about all these value systems. So I think to some extent there is a right to vote and to elect an individual to set the path of values right, but at the same time also provide for people in a way that it is comfortable and safe for them, the security aspect of it.
I agree.
Yeah.
And I don't think we have leaders who in my book now set the example. Because again, one of my passions is the good governance. To me, integrity, honesty, trust in politics matters.
Yeah.
Unless people trust you and you actually set the example of how behavior should be, you can't expect.
But it's also balance in the policies.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, I just think there's a great deal that needs to put right. And I mean, there's no silver bullet there.
Yeah.
It's probably, I think, one of the most difficult areas or times we are in, where a great deal at risk. And it really requires a very mature, very visionary leadership.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
but
I'm
also,
not sure where it's coming from.
But also progressive people on ground. I think it is a combination of two.
I have a great belief in people, and that's why I've always been a great believer in what I call bottom-up change. And that's why I think my focus now is to work with younger people, where you can begin, because I think the young people are really bright, they're idealistic, they know what they want, but they're kind of set down by the system.
Yeah.
Therefore, if you can begin to create a cadre of people in terms of who will begin to say and flex their muscles to say, look, this is what we want. And if there's any hope, I think we've got to work with those social movements on the ground with the young people.
Yeah. So as a closing part to the discussion that we're having, what I want to talk about is the right-wing rhetoric or the rise of right-wing rhetoric that we have and the historic parallels. Okay. So historians often speak of cycle of civilizations, suggesting that societies sometimes face decline after periods of prosperity due to political division, shifts in values that we spoke about, or overreach. And one of the greatest examples would be the Roman Empire and the collapse of Roman Empire as we knew of it. With the rise of right-wing rhetoric in a lot of parts of the world, Do you think there are warning signs we should look out for first? Second, and are there lessons that could help us strengthen our foundation and prevent a similar decline?
I'm one of these people, I'm always hopeful. And therefore I think yes, because, if I had a counsel of despair, I wouldn't be working after 53 years. The fact
Yeah.
I'm still hanging in there and working is because I do think, you can. What I would say is that the right-wing rhetoric that you're getting, rather than have a kind of a social media tweet and condemn them, what we need, if we really want to deal with it, is to go beyond the rhetoric. Why are they saying it? Why are they succeeding? What are the things that we have to do to counter that? And I think, so I would be in favor of, for example, when people say, because as you rightly say, if people we haven't felt the benefit of democracies making a difference to their lives, they're falling into the hands of populists. What is it that we need to do to make a difference, to be able to make sure that they do not fall for that kind of rhetoric? So I think we're at that cusp, and I feel there are lessons that can be learned. And I'm hoping that in countries where, the recent elections in America, we were in a kind of a change here that, we got the Labour government, but their victory is not that deep because, they won because the Reform Party made inroads into the Tory vote.
Exactly, yeah.
So I think they've got to sort of step back and say, how do they deepen that commitment? But I think what worries me is that people are still looking at short term. There isn't that vision that I would love to see, where people can say, look, these are the things you've got to put right. And when I talked about leveling up, making sure that everybody feels the benefit of prosperity. First of all, you got to get prosperity because there are problems too with growth and so on. So I think we've got to sit and analyze these things. Maybe that's the way I approach things. You've got to analyze what the problem is. Whereas I think the tendency is that we use this rather hyperbole and sort of rhetoric, which kind of generates more and more social media. And people think more outrageous they are in what they say, the stronger they will be, whereas that's not the reason. And I'm hoping that the Democrats in America and here and the Liberal Democrats will begin to think, why is it happening? What are the excesses or what they haven't done right? Have they been too complacent? So we need to think about ways of actually changing both the narrative, the dialogue, the approach.
And you think people will be ready for that? People on ground, do you think they're ready for that change?
Oh, yes. When I talk to sort of younger people, I think, some work with young people, and I just find they are thoughtful, they have right ideas, but what they don't have is channels through which. And I think, at least in this country, you may be a very idealistic or person with the right ideas, but the minute you get into Parliament, you're whipped, right? You got to follow the party line. You get kind of caught up in that. So one needs to kind of shift some of the way things are done. These are bigger questions. How do you ensure that you harness the views of the younger people and their worldview?
Yeah. That brings me to my favorite section, women and women empowerment. I cannot think of a person better than you to talk about that. You have been first in so many ways, first woman of color, immigrant. We've spoken about your career, so many firsts in your career. And I think one of the most remarkable things about your career is representation that you have in the House of Lords. You were admitted to you were appointed as a life peer in 1999 as a member of Parliament, House of Lords. I think you were part of the Tony Blair's movement to have more women in...
No. I don't think I was part of that movement, because one thing which needs to be clear, I was appointed before there was a House of Lords Appointments Commission. And myself and another Asian peer, Lord Naren Patel, who's a doctor, we were the first two people from the minority background who were appointed at crossbenches on the grounds of what we had done professionally. Whereas, if I may say so, the others came through the party process.
Yes.
Those who came afterwards had to apply to the House of Lords Appointments Commission, whereas we were the two. So I don't think it was anything to do with a woman. It was partly, I mean, is what
Of
he
course,
and
your career and your
and
achievements,
and the career, because you see, I react to that simply because I think you kind of diminish it. You see, as because of a woman I got there. That's
No,
not.
no.
No, but I wanted to make it clear to
Yeah.
you. It is because it's easier if you're a party person, you know, the party appoints you and you get there
Yeah,
and so
yeah,
on.
yeah.
But that is a distinction.
But by the merit, of course, you got there. But you were also the first Asian woman to be here. This is a huge representation for many women on ground who didn't until then. They didn't even know if that path even existed for them.
Well, it's not even it wasn't a path, you see. I mean, what I'm saying to you is, it was the career thing, right? I want to reach a stage in society where it should be inconsequential, right? And my view really is, it's inconsequential because it's it's what you do, how you do it, okay? Because I mean, to some extent, if you start making too much song and dance, you know what I mean, that becomes the issue. You know,
But
you know, I'm not saying it's not important in terms of illustrating, right? But the sheer fact it happened should send the message anyway, without having to beat the drum about it.
But that means that you are saying that as a woman, you have never faced any discrimination. Did you not feel that your merit to some extent was discounted? Or did you not think that it would have probably been earlier in your career that you would have had so many more achievements?
I know. It sounds very strange to you, but you know, no. I became director of Runnymede at the age of 28, right? At that time, again, I was the first woman to head a charity, NCVO. So you see, when you tell me about the fact that had I not suffered any discrimination, right? Maybe I wasn't conscious of it. I just got on and did it, right? And if you look at my career, even NCVO, I became director of NCVO, chief executive, at the age of 34. So what I'm trying to tell you is that I'm not saying there is no discrimination. Please don't take that as a fact. What I'm trying to tell you is that there are ways of looking at it. If you concentrate too much and you develop a victim mentality, this is happening to me because I'm a woman or I'm an Asian or I'm an immigrant, right? I mean, you actually develop a victim mentality and you actually diminish yourself to some extent. You have to focus on your competence and know, because I always say to women, be resilient, be sure of who you are. In whatever work I do, I want them to be confident. Okay? Confident of your ability. And that is not to say, I mean, believe in me, I'm not saying there's no discrimination. Of course there is discrimination. Right?
You just never let that got to you.
It didn't get to me, right?
Never.
Well, the point really is, people ask me this, it sounds very strange, right? If you look at my career, if I'd been discriminated against, would I have got those positions?
But your merit, your competency was way above the bar, right?
But was it above? I don't know. The point really is I had the ability to do the job. It wasn't above or below. I had the ability to do the job, and I did that job to the best of my ability.
And so you never let that get to you.
I don't let that get to me.
Never.
The point,
how do you get
but
past
that doesn't mean that I have not fought for it. I mean, I have fought for equality. I have fought for dismantling of institutional racism. I have fought for all of that. I have supported people. But the point really is, all I'm really saying to you is, you've got to strike the balance here. There is discrimination, but it's also how you respond to it. Right?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, when I was appointed to the House of Lords, I'll be honest with you, the headlines in The Guardian was, prisons and parole with the top award, because what I had done at the parole board. Right? So I think, I don't want to be misunderstood because people will say, I mean, I'm not in any way denying, the fact women feel that there is discrimination. But sometimes if you're so conscious of it, you can see it in every situation. And by seeing it in every situation, you undermine yourself.
I think I can agree with you on that because I'm aware of the discrimination that I face at work, and there is obviously a level of competency, but I'm sometimes more indexed on the fact that you said victim mindset, and I agree with you. I carry that with me and I become super conscious about it, so much so that I'm trying to overcompensate for it in some ways.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. And the point really is, I mean, I've been in cheeky situations, when I've been on boards, I'm the only woman, you know what I mean? Men will be there talking about, cricket and they leave you out. And I will say, well, stop talking about cricket, let's talk about fashion. So you make a joke of it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or you can say, oh, well, they left me out, because they were talking about cricket. I mean, you know what I mean? There's a
I've
way.
had that reaction
So
many times.
you can see how you deal with it.
Yeah.
And that's when I say you work with women to make them resilient, to be able to stand up to this. That is not to say it doesn't exist, but it's how you take it. Then if you become always conscious of the fact, right, you can actually undermine yourself.
Okay, this brings me to the last section of the show, which is to know about your personal legacy. You've had a rich career, so much that you've learned, so much that you've given back to the community. What is one legacy that you wish to leave behind?
I think I find that difficult because I've never thought in terms of legacies. Because whenever I use John, people say to me, do something what you will leave behind. Now, it sounds horrible, but I never think that's self-serving. You know what I mean? It's not, I do it and it's there, right? And I suppose what I hope people will actually, those who are minded to, will be inspired by the thoughts and my values, I think that's the important. But to me, values are very important. You succeed because of your values. Because my motto in life is, whatever you do, do for the right reasons. If you do it for the right reasons, you will succeed. Okay? Now, I'm hoping that people will actually look at those core values, which is the reason for. Okay? And again, I'll tell you another anecdote. A friend of mine who's Jewish, she said that it's a Jewish custom that when Jewish parents leave a will, they leave something, the value they would like their children to live by. And I think what a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's much more important in life. And when I talk about spirituality, my guiding thing has always been, I look at Bhagavad Gita not as a religious book, it's a book which is guide for life. And it basically says, for me, that the biggest lesson is, do your duty, have no expectations. So I'm afraid I've tried to apply that. So to me, it's those living values that matter. See, when you were asking me about, what is it, and I think to me, it's those values, I hope. People will be able to go beyond and see, what motivated me, what are the values. That to me would be an important thing. When I talk to people, I talk about values.
And what is one message that you want to give to the young population out there, to the youngsters out there who are distressed by so much of the division that they see in the political, in the geopolitical environment, the macroeconomic environment? What is one message that you would like to give to that audience as your message of hope?
Message of hope is, don't concentrate on the negative. In every situation, there's a positive. Pick the positive, build on it, build your resilience, get on and do it.
Amazing.